Good evening, everybody, and welcome to our fifth session of the series Vibing with the Venerables. We have discussed and reflected upon Dorothy Day with Kelly Johnson. By the way, her surgery went very well. We have reflected upon Oscar Romero, and I did those two reflections. And today we have here with us Kathy Stout, who is going to reflect upon Thomas Merton today and the next Friday. Kathy Stout is a student in the doctoral program at the University of Dayton. She is an immigrant from China and has been a member of St. Francis of Assisi Parish, lives in Miamisburg, and now is on the verge of becoming a doctoral candidate at the University of Dayton. Her doctoral dissertation is going to be on interreligious dialogue, and Thomas Merton is in some way integral to her dissertation. She's publishing an article very soon about it, and please welcome Kathy Stout to lead our reflection for this evening.
Good evening. Thank you so much for being here. There must be a ton of things you could do on a Friday evening, then come to the parish church and hear about a man who was born over a century ago. And if you have persisted with the Vibing with the Venerables series, clearly you're someone who loves God and are deeply committed to His church. So seeing your dedication here tonight is a reminder for myself to think about all that God has done for me. So thank you for that. I should say a little more about myself before we begin. It was over 11 years ago that my family came into the Catholic Church, welcomed by the warm and friendly parish of St. Francis of Assisi on Wilmington Pike. The priest there was the late Father Tom Schmidt. Mary Ellen was our great RCIA director. That community has helped us with so much grace and patience that our family will forever be grateful. So as an immigrant to this country and a convert to the church, I'm constantly amazed at the many blessings I have received in this country. Perhaps only here, in a country of immigrants, and in the church, which is very proud of being Catholic and universal, can someone like me get the opportunity to study for a doctorate in theology at UD, to teach young undergraduate students there about religious studies, and to be here with you tonight to talk about a spiritual giant of the 20th century. I'm reminded of the surprising grace of Jesus, who invited all kinds of unlikely people into His friendship. I'm also encouraged by the childlike and amused face of Thomas Merton, which you see here, who looks as if saying, "Welcome to the gift of life." So let me begin by sharing a little bit of my own journey with Thomas Merton. I wrote my master's thesis on John of the Cross at the University of Dayton under the direction of Dr. Sandra Yoakum, who attends this parish here, I think. She recommended me to read a book by Merton entitled The Ascent to Truth. That was my first time encountering his work. Unbeknownst to me at the time, Merton would eventually introduce me to his Chinese friend, John C.H. Wu, who was an extremely influential political leader and intellectual of 20th century China. So Merton would be delighted to know that it was through his friendship with John Wu that I was reintroduced to the beauty of the religious and cultural traditions of China, which I didn't get an opportunity to appreciate in depth while growing up there because of the cultural upheavals the country had gone through. So after becoming Catholic by reading European spiritual writers, I have now become truly Chinese by reading an American Catholic monk who lived in Kentucky. Again, welcome to the gift of life. So I have much to thank to Merton. He has done a lot of good for my soul. Tonight, I would like to reflect on what Merton can still do for all of us. His best-selling autobiography, The 7-Story Mountain, is probably well known to many of the older generations. But as a matter of curiosity, have you heard of this book or read it? That's very good, actually. The percentage is good. I would be lucky if 1 or 2 of my undergraduate students have read the book. Most of the time, they have not even heard of his name. Yet in 2015, when Pope Francis came to the United States, in his speech to Congress, he singled Merton out as one of the 4 Americans, extraordinary Americans, along with Abraham Lincoln, MLK Jr., and Dorothy Day. And this is what the Pope says. Merton was a man of prayer, a thinker who challenged the certitudes of his time and opened new horizons for souls and for the church. He was also a man of dialogue, a promoter of peace between peoples and religions. This is a high praise from the Pope. To echo this sentiment, I believe that Merton remains a powerful inspiration for us today because of his wisdom and authenticity. Particularly, I want to emphasize 2 aspects of his work today. The first is his role as a cultural critic, and the second is his role as a spiritual guide. His prophetic insights as a cultural critic, often disturbing to both ends of the ideological spectrum, are still relevant to us today. His honesty and authenticity as a spiritual master can be helpful to the next generation of young people who are looking for truth and meaning in a chaotic world. My plan for tonight is to first look at some biographical sketches of his life, then share some of his work as a cultural critic, and then consider his insights as a spiritual guide, and finally to offer some suggestions for prayer based on his inspiration. Let's begin with a general glance of Merton's life. Merton was born in France in the year 1915, during the First World War, in the shadow of the Pyrenees on the borders of Spain. His mother was Ruth Jenkins from New York, and father was Owen Merton from New Zealand. They were artists who had met in Paris. Father was a painter, and his mother was an interior designer. As son of 2 artists, Merton would inherit from them a great capacity for artistic sensibility and creative expression. He would also inherit a modernist approach to religion, which is to say, being skeptical toward religious institutions and interested, above all, in the personal dimension of experience and authenticity. Owen Merton formerly belonged to the Church of England. Ruth Jenkins attended an Episcopalian church in New York and later became a nominal Quaker. She was probably more of a deist who attached little importance to any kind of church attendance. She died of stomach cancer when Merton was 6. Owen Merton would die of a brain tumor when Merton was 16. Emotionally, Merton was closer to his dad, especially as they went continent hopping, as Owen pursued a career as a painter in Europe after his wife's death. It was from his father that Merton acquired many of his literary and artistic preferences. He remembers his father as a genuinely spiritual person who, although not institutionally devout, at moments would exhibit a true and honest faith. One of his earliest mystical experiences would involve feeling the presence of his deceased father in a hotel room in the city of Rome. Merton had a brother, John Paul, who was 2 years younger, who died at age 24 during the Second World War while flying over the English Channel with the Royal Canadian Air Force. When news reached Merton that John Paul was missing in action, he was already in the Abbey of Gethsemane in Kentucky. In fact, shortly before John Paul's deployment with the military, he was able to visit Merton, receive catechetical instruction at the monastery, and received baptism from him. I would like to share with you a poem Merton wrote in commemoration of his brother's death, which is probably one of the most beautiful poems he ever wrote. Sweet brother, if I do not sleep, my eyes are flowers for your tomb. And if I cannot eat my bread, my fasts shall live like willows where you died. If in the heat I find no water for my thirst shall turn to springs for you, poor traveler. Where, in what desolate and smoky country lies your poor body, lost and dead? And in what landscape of disaster has your unhappy spirit lost its road? Come, in my labor find a resting place, and in my sorrows lay your head, or rather take my life and blood, and buy yourself a better bed. Or take my breath and take my death, and buy yourself a better rest. When all the men of war are shot, and flags have fallen into dust, your cross and mine shall tell men still, Christ died on each for both of us. For in the wreckage of your April, Christ lies slain, and Christ weeps in the ruins of my spring. The money of whose tears shall fall into your weak and friendless hand, and buy you back to your own land. The silence of whose tears shall fall like bells upon your alien tomb. Hear them and come, they call you home. Here is an outline of Merton's life divided into different stages. The first period ends with his unfortunate departure from Cambridge University. He had been supported by his maternal grandparents from New York after the passing of his parents, and was looked after by a designated custodian in England who was his godfather. He was studying modern languages at Cambridge, but he partied a lot more than he studied. His dissolute lifestyle led to an unintended pregnancy, the loss of his scholarship, and an embarrassing exile from England ordered by his godfather. The second period of his life begins with a transfer to Columbia University, where he would earn a bachelor's and master's in English. And this was a fruitful period in his life. The great circle of friends he made there, their joint intellectual pursuits, and the classes he took on literature and philosophy were so stimulating that he not only read a wide range of influential authors, but also became drawn to the Catholic Church, despite his prior prejudices against institutional authority. He was baptized in 1938. Soon after, he began teaching English at St. Bonaventure's College in New York, and at the same time applied to join a Franciscan religious order. His application was rejected, probably due to his admission of guilt for his dissolute behavior at Cambridge. It was apparently too shocking. It was a good thing, though, that he did not give up the desire for religious life. 1 year later, he was able to enter the Abbey of the Trappist Monastery of Gethsemane in Kentucky. He was almost 27 years old at the time. In 1968, he would die in the city of Bangkok while attending a monastic conference 27 years to the day of his entrance to Gethsemane. So quite an eerie coincidence. Merton was the most famous monk of the 20th century, most vocal and most productive. He wrote over 60 books, hundreds of poems and articles, thousands of journal entries, tens of thousands of letters in correspondence with people from around the world. His autobiography, The SevenStory Mountain, sold over 1 million copies, was translated into over 15 languages, and attracted many Americans to religious life in the decade after World War II. With this voluminous output, I would advise that anyone should be careful if you develop an interest in Merton. It may end up being a lifetime obsession. In that case, you would join a large circle of Merton devotees who continue to meet together every year to write about him, to discuss his inspiration for the contemporary world. One of the latest publications about Merton is Sophronia Scott's book, The Seeker and the Monk, Everyday Conversations with Thomas Merton. And the author is a professional writer of fiction and nonfiction who is Episcopalian, not Catholic. And every month there is a webinar series hosted by the International Thomas Merton Society and the Center for Spirituality in St. Mary's College at Notre Dame, which is free and open to the public. And as you can tell, Merton's appeal goes beyond his own time and beyond the Catholic Church. Now I would like to show you a photo montage highlighting some moments of his life. In the center is Merton in front of his hermitage. On the top left, we see the French town of Antonin, where he and his father stayed after his mother passed away. On the bottom left is the Occam High School in England, where he attended before entering Cambridge. On the top right is his very first hermitage at Gethsemane. He called it St. Anne's in honor of the Mother Mary, and it was really a converted tool shed. At bottom right is his final resting place in the monastery. On this slide, only the top left is prior to his entering of the monastery, and that's him posing with the faculty at St. Bonaventure's College in New York, where he taught English literature. Moving to the right and going clockwise, we have him working with his fellow monks, conversing with the visitor on the monastery grounds, typing away at the library about contemplation and whatnot, enjoying a walk with a fellow monk and a visitor, and chatting in his hermitage with his friend Jacques Maritain, a French Catholic philosopher. Here, let's go back. There we go. In the center here is Merton celebrating his first solemn high mass after ordination. To the right, we see him at the time of his ordination. On the upper left is him with a group of nuns on retreat. On the lower right is him experimenting with his Zen camera. In the last few years of his life, he became very fond of taking pictures as a new way of seeing God's presence in the world. This slide shows Merton and his Buddhist friends. Going clockwise from the top left, we have Zen monk Thich Nhat Hanh from Vietnam, the Dalai Lama, Chatro Rinpoche, a Tibetan Buddhist master, and Dr. D.T. Suzuki from Japan. Now, Merton had to communicate through a translator with the Dalai Lama and Rinpoche. What impresses me a great deal is the kind of rapport that you see between these men. They come from completely different religious traditions, and yet they act like brothers, respecting each other and learning deeply from each other the wisdom of a different ancient tradition. Merton and the Dalai Lama met only 3 brief times on 3 consecutive days in 1968, but their spiritual bond, which formed at that time, has lasted even to this day. The Dalai Lama has said that it was Merton who showed him the true meaning of the word Christian. Their friendship was so substantial that it has inspired an inter-monastic dialogue between Catholic and Buddhist monks since the year 1996. Their first meeting was held at Gethsemane in honor of Merton on recommendation by the Dalai Lama, who was himself present in Kentucky and visited Merton's grave. At the monastery in 1996, the Dalai Lama said this: "When I was a boy in Tibet, I felt that my own Buddhist religion must be the best, and that other faiths were somehow inferior. Now I see how naive I was, and how dangerous the extremes of religious intolerance can be today. An early eye-opener for me was my meeting with the Trappist monk Thomas Merton in India, shortly before his untimely death in 1968. Merton told me that he could be perfectly faithful to Christianity, yet learn in depth from other religious traditions like Buddhism. The same is true for me as an ardent Buddhist learning from the world's other great religions." It is a beautiful thing to hear this from the holy Buddhist. I think in the years to come, Thomas Merton will continue to make great contributions to the cause of interreligious dialogue in a tangible way he has already made and will continue to make the world a more peaceful place. I will stop here with the photos and move on to the two main themes that I would like to discuss tonight, which are first, Merton's role as a cultural critic, and second, his role as a spiritual guide. He was much more than those, of course. He was also a novelist, a poet, a monk, a priest, an artist, an essayist, peace advocate, novice master, and master of scholastics. Let's just say he lived an intense life, an intensely rich life, so much so that we can only scratch the surface tonight. What you see on the slide here is an original calligraphy piece by Merton depicting the nuclear bomb at the end of World War II. So first, Merton as a cultural critic. Oops, let's not do that yet. Cultural critics come in different stripes. Some are intellectuals who bemoan the overshadowing of Western society by modern and postmodern secular ideology. Some are journalists and essayists who offer cultural prognosis on where society is going based on what they observe from myriad phenomena in popular culture. Some criticize the decline of religion in Western civilization. Others focus on the pervasive ill effects of consumerism and capitalism. Still others concentrate on aspects of social injustice caused by prejudice and inequality. As we can imagine, cultural critics dabble in controversial topics. They tend to have an acute awareness of the tensions in society, and yet their diagnosis and proposal are not always greeted with universal acceptance. In fact, the social-political divisiveness that Americans experience is very much reflected in the ideological divide among cultural critics. Yet Merton, I would argue, was a different kind of critic. He criticizes not to divide, but to heal. He exposes the darkness in society only to cauterize it with the divine flame of the gospel. He points out how bleak things are, but always retains an unfailing hope. I am encouraged every time I see the childlike simplicity and exuberant smile on his face. And I would like to say that he is an exceptional critic precisely because of his unique role as a monastic. Much like the desert fathers and mothers in the 3rd and 4th centuries, Merton left the secular world, not in spite of it, but in order to love it more deeply. And much like the Jewish prophets and like Jesus himself, Merton was able to critique the secular world effectively because he's rooted in the firm soil of the kingdom of heaven. So here's what he says about the self-understanding of the United States. I quote, "What is the conventionally accepted American myth? It is this: America is the earthly paradise. The discovery of America galvanized and inebriated the Western world. It revolutionized the thought of Western man. He was now convinced that the human society was getting off to an entirely new start, to escape from history, that is to say, from Europe, to escape from the burdens of the past, to return to the source, to begin again in a new history, starting from scratch without original sin. This was what America offered to the oppressed, the persecuted, the unsuccessful, the disinherited. To be baptized by immigration, to leave one's sins and one's past in the Atlantic, to start out for a new life in the wilderness with one's hand in the hand of God. There have been foreign wars in which America has been persuaded to take part only when convinced that we would ride into battle as cowboys. After every war, which we, being the good guys, have always won, we have, with the utmost sincerity, exported just a little bit of our innocence, just a little bit of our paradisiacal idealism to the lands sunken in history and sin. Yet more and more, the lands of sin, the countries of history, have tended to observe that we are no longer the earthly paradise. That is the end of the American myth. We can no longer lean out from a higher and rarefied atmosphere and point down from the firmament to the men on earth to show them the patterns of our ideal republic. We are in the same mess as all the rest of them. End quote. Now, Merton wrote this sometime in the late 50s or early 60s, in what is generally considered the post-war consensus period in the US, where there was bipartisan support for most US foreign policy initiatives. Most Americans then had a boosted level of self-confidence in the benevolent role of the United States in world affairs after its success in the Second World War. They were likewise galvanized in their collective antagonism with the Soviet Russia in the emerging Cold War. What Merton said here could not have been very popular, yet its truth seemed quite clear to us today. The United States is very much in the same mess as the rest of the world. And what about our attitude toward our ideological opponents? On this, Merton also had great insights. I quote, Gandhi once asked, "How can we who think that we possess absolute truth be fraternal?" Let us be frank about it. The history of Christianity raises this question again and again. The problem, God has revealed himself to men in Christ, but he has revealed himself, first of all, as love. Only he who loves can be sure that he is still in contact with the truth, which is in fact too absolute to be grasped by the mind. Today, we are told hatred of communism is the test of a good Christian. The pledge of all truth is our political hate. Hate Castro, hate Khrushchev, hate Mao. All this in the same breath as God's merciful love and the beatings of the Sacred Heart. There seems to be some other dimension that we have not discovered, end quote. In our day and age, we no longer think of communism as the one mortal enemy. Yet we witness the same kind of animosity against one's ideological opponents in many pockets of society. Perhaps we do not hate our opposites, but it's very easy to think that we have nothing in common with them, that we can in no way have any productive dialogue with them. But Merton will remind us that it is necessary for us to rediscover again and again the dimension of love, even when it comes to our political and ideological opponents. Merton also speaks about the particular modern problem of technocracy. Many Catholic intellectuals in the early 20th century were worried about the trajectory of technocracy. Will life become more human or less human with the rapid and pervasive encroachment of technology? As much as I appreciate indoor plumbing and the vast amount of resources available to me at my fingertips on my iPhone, this pandemic has made me shudder like never before at the destructive potential of the human quest for technological prowess. For starters, what if the virus indeed escaped from a laboratory? What if our desire for technological innovation gave us a virus that has now killed millions worldwide? And what about the environmental damage we have incurred due to the unstinting spread of industrialization? At the time of Merton's writing, he was also worried about an imminent threat of a nuclear war, which could still happen today. And this is what he says. I quote, "The central problem of the modern world is the complete emancipation and autonomy of the technological mind at a time when unlimited possibilities lie open to it and all the resources seem to be at hand. The consequence is this, that technology and science are now responsible to no power. Other than their own. Technology has its own ethic of expediency and efficiency. So what can be done efficiently must be done in the most efficient way, even if what is done happens, for example, to be genocide or the devastation of a country by total war. Even the long-term economic interests of society or the basic needs of man himself are not considered when they get in the way of technology. We waste our natural resources as well as those of undeveloped countries, iron, oil, etc., in order to fill our cities and roads with a congestion of traffic that is in fact largely useless and is a symptom of the meaningless and futile agitation of our own minds." End quote. So what I hear Merton saying here is that more contemplation and less domination will be good for the soul of our society and for the interests of the common people. Surely we cannot argue with that. Right now, when our billionaires are busy trying to conquer Mars and make life multi-planetary, do we not find that we are often spiritually starved and confused? Will the future of humanity be driven by the power of technology controlled by a few? Or will it be truly human because enough of us care to slow down to breathe and to appreciate the simple gifts all around us? That was a question for Merton then, and it is a question for us today. Another topic that Merton was very vocal about was the peace movement in the 1960s. The Jesuit priest and pacifist Daniel Berrigan calls him pastor to the peace movement. His article, Christian Roots of Nonviolence, is considered by many to be the greatest contribution, his greatest contribution to the cause of nonviolence, and one of the all-time greatest reflections on the topic. So here's a quotation from that article. "Christian nonviolence is not built on a presupposed division, but on the basic unity of man. It is not out of the conversion of the wicked to the good, ideas of the good, but for the healing and reconciliation of man with himself. The nonviolent resistor is not fighting simply for his truth or for his pure conscience or for the right that is on his side. On the contrary, both his strength and his weakness come from the fact that he's fighting for the truth common to him and to his adversary, the right that is objective and universal. He's fighting for everybody." Now, reading this today reminds me of the great beatitude that Jesus taught, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God." Those who refrain from violence is not timid. They're not timid or fearful of a fight. Rather, they are fighting the one necessary battle of human existence, which is how not to lose our sanity as human beings. Though many have appreciated Merton's prophetic insights on peace and nonviolence, he faced hierarchical censure from his own monastic order on the subject. He was forbidden to write anything publicly on the topic. But he managed to circumvent the censure by circulating 2 books privately among his circle of friends, and he had many, many friends. So when in 1963, Pope John XXIII released his encyclical on peace, Pacem in terris, Merton remarked poignantly that the Pope fortunately didn't have to go through the Cistercian censors. Otherwise, it would never have been published. At this point, I was going to show you a short video of Merton himself speaking just hours before his death in Bangkok. But it turns out I actually can't play a video while being on live stream. So I want to mention this, though, because it was wonderful for me to catch a glimpse of the man himself speaking in his own living voice, and to imagine how good it would have been to know him in person. But I would like to mention this talk as a conclusion to our first theme, Merton as a cultural critic, and also as a segue onto our next theme, Merton as a spiritual guide. So Merton was in Bangkok, speaking to a group of Catholic monastic leaders in Asia, exploring how they might engage non-Catholic cultures and religions in their area. In this talk, the first thing he discussed was the relationship between Christianity and communism. He presented a balanced view of communism that was way ahead of his time and still pertinent to us today. For we still have to wrestle with the appropriate Christian attitude toward communism, toward communist ideology, socialism, and socialist countries such as China. Merton recognizes, on the one hand, that the communist social vision is fundamentally Christian. It is against human alienation. It does not accept economic conditions where people are not in possession of the fruits of their labor. It dreams of a society where each gives according to their capacity and receives according to their needs. Such a vision is not at odds with the kingdom of heaven. It cannot be rejected as evil. On the other hand, Merton points out that in history, only in monastic communities has this social vision ever been realized. This vision of to each according to their capacity, and from to each according to their need, and from each according to their capacity. The great fatal error of communism, Merton would say, is their rejection of God and their rushing forward for the humanity of tomorrow while rejecting its present dignity. In other words, communist ideology is like the parable of the wheat and the chaff. Its social vision for a better future society is absolutely commendable, but its neglect and abuse of the spiritual dimension is not. So with that, I turn now to the second theme of tonight, Merton as a spiritual guide. In this Bangkok talk, Merton tells the story he had heard from Dalai Lama. When confronted by an immediate military invasion from the Chinese army in 1959, the Dalai Lama was caught in the mountains somewhere, living in a peasant's house and wondering what he should do next. He sent a message to a nearby abbot friend of his saying, "What should we do?" The abbot sent back a strange message which says, "From now on, brother, everybody stands on his own feet." This phrase, "from now on, everybody stands on his own feet," became a poignant spiritual reflection for Merton. In the case of the exiled Tibetan monk, it meant that he and his brothers had to leave everything behind that they ever knew. The land, the home, and the culture they had treasured were now no more. They were forced to venture into the unknown and to find their way again, each standing on their own 2 feet. According to Merton, we all have to do the same, for we too have nowhere to turn. We too are in exile from our true home. We too have to face reality as it is and as we are with all our frailty, and we have to decide how to live, to be confronted by the dark abyss of all life's mysteries, especially the unknown and unwelcome. Will we have the courage to believe, to have hope, and to love? This would be Merton's challenge to our young people today. Do we dare to stand on our own 2 feet? Do we have the courage to discover the possibility of true faith? We now live in a voluntary society where faith cannot be simply handed on to the next generation. It must be consciously chosen by each. Like Merton and the Buddhist monks with their backs against the wall, we have no choice but to look into the gravity of our situation as a human being and decide for ourselves where to go. It seems to be our only option if we are not to be crushed by the force of history and simply muddle along. So what can Merton teach us as a spiritual guide? I would like to approach this by briefly discussing 3 of his most important books on spirituality. The first one is his autobiography, 7-Story Mountain. Though it was first published in 1948, and it does not represent the most mature of Merton's writings, his great talent as a writer still makes it a compelling read. Last summer, I forced my 14-year-old son to read it, and he rather enjoyed it because of how well Merton writes. It's like a modern-day Augustine's Confessions, but more interesting. It recounts his journey to faith as a sinful, troubled young man. It will suffice here to read to you the first paragraph of the first chapter, entitled Prisoner's Base. I quote, "On the last day of January 1915, under the sign of the water bearer, in the ear of a great war, and down in the shadows of some French mountains on the borders of Spain, I came into the world. Free by nature, in the image of God, I was nevertheless the prisoner of my own violence and my own selfishness, in the image of the world into which I was born. That world was the picture of hell, full of men like myself, loving God and yet hating him, born to love him, living instead in fear and hopeless, self-contradictory hungers." End quote. So this book has been a critical influence to many. It brought a large influx of young men into monasteries and religious orders in the United States in the post-war decade. It inspired other Catholics, such as Bishop Robert Barron and the Jesuit priest James Martin, in their aspiration to the priesthood. Barron comments that while reading this book, he became completely caught up in the drama and romance of Merton's story, thanks not only to the intensity of his faith, but also his storytelling ability as a literary artist. The book most certainly has become a religious classic, so that I think every young Catholic probably should read it at some point in their youth. The second book I'd like to mention is entitled New Seeds of Contemplation. Published in 1962, this is one of Merton's most popular books. It was praised by Christians and non-Christians alike, and compared to the venerable writings of John of the Cross and other medieval mystics. The book opens with a chapter titled, "What is Contemplation?" To this question, Merton answers, "Contemplation is the highest expression of man's intellectual and spiritual life. It is that life itself, fully awake, fully active, fully aware that it is alive. It is spiritual wonder. It is spontaneous awe at the sacredness of life, of being. It is gratitude of life, gratitude for life, for awareness, and for being." End quote. Now, if this is contemplation, I don't see how it would be alien to the aspiration of any human being. Wouldn't it strike a note even with atheists and agnostics? Wouldn't it provide a bridge with contemplatives from other religious traditions? By this time in 1962, Merton had changed quite a bit since the publication of his autobiography. He was no longer the young monk who had gloried in the fact that he left the world in pursuit of the supernatural life. Now he had realized that a true contemplative cannot isolate himself from the world. So I would like to read an excerpt in a chapter called "The General Dance" from Seeds of New Contemplation, which will showcase his newer, more emphatic acceptance of the world. I quote, "The Lord made his world not in order to judge it, not in order merely to dominate it, to make it obey the dictates of an inscrutable and all-powerful will. not in order to find pleasure or displeasure in the way it worked. Such was not the reason for creation, either of the world or of man. The Lord made the world and made man in order that he himself might descend into the world, that he himself might become man. When he regarded the world he was about to make, he saw his wisdom as a man-child playing in the world, playing before him at all times. And he reflected, my delights are to be with the children of men. The world was not made as a prison for fallen spirits who were rejected by God. This is the Gnostic era. The world was made as a temple, a paradise into which God himself would descend to dwell familiarly with the spirits he had placed there to tend it for him. End quote. The relationship between church and the world is not easy to sort out. Jesus tells us to be in the world but not of the world. He says that his kingdom is not of this world. Yet at the same time, how can we witness to others about the love of God and the good news of salvation if we are contemptuous of the world and if we seclude ourselves from the earthly welfare of others? As the old Christendom of the Middle Ages receded from view, the church realized in the 20th century that she needed to pay more attention to the earthly needs, both material and spiritual, of all the peoples of the world. This is why during the Second Vatican Council, the church proclaims, the joys and the hopes, the griefs and the anxieties of the people of this age, especially those who are poor or in any way afflicted, these are the joys and hopes, the griefs and anxieties of the followers of Christ. Merton reflects this newer emphasis of solidarity with the world by reaching beyond the walls of his monastery through his writings and correspondence with many friends, lending his support to many of the social causes of the time. So to be a monk in the modern world, in his case, meant to be different from a traditional monk. The seeds of contemplation, which can sprout anywhere, inside or outside the monastery, must take root in the world and give life to it. Such a view of contemplation is very helpful for the laity, we who are not monastics or religious or priests. We too can bear within us new seeds of contemplation. We too, in our daily walk, can breathe new life into the world by being attuned to the action of the Holy Spirit. The third book is a collection of Merton's journals, which he had kept for most of his life. I will not read any excerpts from it tonight, as I think the deep intimacy and honesty of the writing kind of forbids a public reading out loud. We have all read stories of the saints, and many of these stories are hagiographical, meaning they tell a glorified or glamorized story of someone who is filled with such virtues that they seem quite distant from our own situation. Now, Merton's journals will show a different, more complicated picture of a man. Here's someone who truly loved God, but he's also someone who had many interior struggles as he sought to know and love God more and to pursue the full potential of a spiritual life. He was tempted at times. He was by nature impetuous. He had serious tensions in his relationship with his superior. He was restless. He didn't behave like an ordinary monk. He even thought that Buddhist monks did something better than his own religious order. Some of you might even know that a few years before his death, he fell in love with a student nurse who cared for him in the hospital. The two had a 6-month clandestine romance. All this sounds scandalous enough. But if you read the entries in his journal about these events, you will see how deeply human his struggles were. He bears his soul to such an extent that in his story we can see a reflection of the struggles of modern society, of American individuals, even of our own lives. The theme that runs throughout these pages is how he might find and live his true self with no more contradictions, no more fake identities, no more pride and obsession about himself. He wanted to be all for God and all in God, to enjoy the full liberty of a child of God. But he was haunted by a set of paradoxical questions. Can he and should he be both a monk and a writer? How can he balance the desire for total solitude with his need for friendship and camaraderie? How does he juggle between the path of spiritual freedom and the limitations of monastic structure? These questions were never completely resolved in his life. I would say that from beginning to end, he remained a wanderer. His journey centered in God was always open-ended. He was born in France, became a monk in the United States, and died mysteriously in Bangkok. He was not afraid of strange terrains and not evasive of his inner demons. He was always sincere, always attentive, and always alive to the present moment. He may not be your typical saint, but I think his honesty and authenticity will provide just the right kind of challenge for us. Like him, we too have our struggles. The question is whether despite these struggles, we can still have an undying faith in the supernatural, in God, in goodness, and in everlasting life. Can we, despite our weakness and foibles, take courage and believe that we are all children of God, who are invited to live with freedom and authenticity? Before we end tonight, I'd like to give you some Merton quotations on prayer. It is the beautiful fall season right now. As we enjoy the weather, spend time in the outdoors, take walks in our neighborhood or in the park, we might find these words helpful in some way. So let's just take a minute to read this quietly. I hope you can read the slides. One of Merton's favorite things to do is to pray in the woods. I hope we all get to spend some quality time in the natural surroundings this fall by ourselves or with our family and friends. And as we do, I hope we get a sense of our oneness with nature and with each other in God. Life is fragile, problematic, and dangerous, as we found out in the last 2 years. But it is also beautiful, alert, full of potential, full of hope, surprising and mysterious. Merton is now at rest, but our journey in this world continues. Like him, we hope to become fully alive. We hope to face all the limitations and darkness of life with courage and a good smile. We are indeed all beginners in life all the time, and this is good news, not bad. By accepting ourselves, we become better at accepting others and accepting God. So to conclude, I'm going to pray a prayer written by Merton. And all of us can join together at the end by saying amen. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, amen. My Lord God, I have no idea where I am going. I do not see the road ahead of me. I cannot know for certain where it will end. Nor do I really know myself. The fact that I think I am following your will does not mean that I am actually doing so. But I believe that the desire to please you does in fact please you. And I hope that I will never do anything apart from that desire. Amen. Thomas Merton, Father Louis, pray for us. The Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. All right. I don't know if we should have some questions. If you do have a question, you can use the mic in the aisle here.
Hi, good evening.
Hi.
Thanks for your lecture. Yeah, I just had a question about that one, I guess it was poetry or the writing. What does Merton mean by finding the desert? Why is he trying to find the desert?
Oh, yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, there are multiple sources where he gets the idea of the importance of the desert. Well, if we go back to the Bible, Jesus himself went into the desert before his public ministry started. And then, of course, in the 4th century, we had the desert fathers and mothers who lived the life of solitude there. So in the spiritual life, the concept of the desert is a period of purification that is necessary for us to discern God's will in our lives, to come to know ourselves. It's sort of like, think about the prayer and fasting we're encouraged to do during the period of Lent, right? And that's a preparation for the joy and jubilation that would come with the Easter celebration. So you have the desert, which is a period of aridity, but which is also a preparation for the joy later on. And in general, if you read any spiritual writers from the Catholic faith, they will tell you that the desert is necessary. You cannot experience spiritual joy unless you have gone through the period of darkness. So in Merton's case, the desert, he says, is just ourself. When you come to know who you are, there are a lot of things we may not like in ourselves. And to not run away, but to face our weakness is a pretty scary thing. It's not easy at all. And he thinks that in order for us to mature as a Christian, to grow in our spiritual life, we cannot run away. We have to know ourselves exactly as we are. So that is his concept of the desert.
I'm struck that 2 of the 3 people that we've been learning about in this series were converts to Christianity, so Dorothy Day and now Thomas Merton. And I'm curious, they have such good understanding of Catholicism and such enlightening thoughts. And I'm wondering if you have any ideas on how the conversion played a role in that, or if that was a significant factor, or it's just a matter that they're both very intelligent, thoughtful people.
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. I am a convert myself, and I happen to, my favorite writers all happen to be converts. So that has to be, that's not an accident, right? So with Dorothy Day and with Thomas Merton, and you see the intensity and passion in their faith, and I think being a convert really does make a great difference, because you have this contrast, right? If you read his autobiography, and Dorothy Day as well, you have this contrast, a deeply felt experience of the before and the after. I know what I have been given by God, right? So therefore, it is a powerful driving force for everything they said and did. What make them kind of distinct because of their experience as a convert? I think that's very hard to say, but in the early part of the 20th century, we had many people, philosophers, literary writers, priests, who were converts to the church. I think it was a traumatic period in history, right? We had disasters, a lot of them. And the Christian church was also in a lot of trouble. So in that turbulent time, when people were dealing with personal issues as well as social issues, they were able to find their way to the church and then somehow experience in the bottom of their heart the goodness of God in the Catholic Church. I think that's really amazing. I guess just read them all, get to know all of these converts and see why they love the church, right? And I think it's helpful to be inspired by them, because in our day right now, Catholics don't always have a good idea of how to relate to other religions, right? We want to be open and inclusive, but at the same time, we need to know what we have, right? So it's helpful to read converts from their perspective, right?
Thank you for the beautiful talk that you gave. In this prayer, for instance, Thomas Merton seems to have a lot of doubts about himself. So where did he find the strength to follow God?
Yeah. He was definitely a sensitive person, and it's because he was an artist. You know, artists have sort of a perceptive capacity, right? They see things other people wouldn't see. They feel very intensely. And I think that's why he probably comes off as having a lot of doubt. But then you just go on. You go on and figure out what's happening. Now, he really never had any serious doubt of the faith after his conversion. So there's nowhere you would read some kind of serious question, you know, should I still be a Catholic? That never happens. But his desire and goal is to experience union with God in everyday walk, right? So he's not content with just being a normal Catholic who, you know, receives the sacraments and goes through the motions and lives a comfortable life, a regimented life in a monastery. He believes in spiritual realization that is felt. Right? So if that's important to you, then you will experience doubt. There's absolutely no way around it. I would think that's why. But from another point of view, his doubt is helpful for the rest of us. And I especially think about the young people today. The young people are looking for experience as well. They're not satisfied with just being told, well, receive the sacraments, you know, fulfill your Catholic duty, do what you're expected to do. That does not work anymore. And if they don't experience a fullness, at least sometime in life, they're not going to be a very happy camper, right? So when we see Merton's doubt, that's just part of life. And we are told, encouraged by him to not be afraid, because even in doubt, God is present. Right? We feel like we're struggling, we're walking all alone by ourselves, but God is there And there was absolutely no doubt in his heart about that. That is why he was able to go on. And through all his struggles, he gained so much more. When he writes about different issues, you see the conviction, you see the beauty of his faith. And all of that comes from the fruit of his struggles, by facing those struggles.
So you have somebody like Augustine who has a wild life, conversion. And then he kind of stays on the straight. So you have Merton, has a wild life, has a conversion, enters a monastery. So what is going on 6 months prior to? Is it illness? Is it some spiritual emptiness? Is it a theological struggle? What's going on by which he finally, just, in other words, having experienced what he did, what is leading, what's going on? So I'm not so much interested in the fact that he had an affair, but what's going on? Does anyone written any insights into that?
Yeah. I think he was a little bit impetuous, and I think sometimes he probably ought to be more careful because the kind of spiritual path he had chosen, he wanted to be open to God at all times. So when he woke up in the hospital and this beautiful nurse was caring for him, it was a spiritual experience for him. She was like Eve, waking him up, and he was like in a paradise. Anyway, if he was not a monastic, if he was not a priest, he could very well end up in a relationship where through that relationship he came to love God in a much deeper way. And I think that was part of his experience with this woman. It was a dimension in life that was not his before. So his life was enriched in a deep way. But life is complicated. He was also very aware that he could not be with her, even if somehow priests could be married, or if he left the monastic life for her, he would still not be happy because his other love was for solitude, for the life of contemplation. He realized that he could never be happy with her, even though the relationship was beautiful on many, many levels. So in the end, then it was just a weird episode. I mean, from an outsider's perspective. If he had been more, mature, vigilant, maybe it wouldn't have gone that far. But it did happen, and I think it's important to keep in mind that he did not leave the order, right? He could have done that. Many people in the 60s left the religious order. Many people left the priesthood. Many people left to get married. He could have totally done that, but he did not. And the reason he remained was not to make his monastery happy. It was because he chose his original spiritual path. He wanted to love God through contemplation. So I don't know if that answered your question. She moved away, and I don't think we really hear from her, which is probably a good thing. But she got married with somebody else. Yeah. Could you go to the mic so the computer could pick up your volume? Mm-hmm.
So you said that that encounter he had with the woman was, what am I looking for? I guess I'm just kind of wondering why it was wrong. You said it that he may have viewed it as a spiritual experience? when
Yes,
he
it
came
was
to-
definitely spiritual, but
So is it the vow he made as a monk that made that encounter wrong?
well, I think what was wrong about it, most of all, was the scandalous nature of it. Obviously, we cannot judge how this is going to be assessed in the manner of eternity. That's nobody has any idea about that. But just from the outsider's perspective, I think it probably would have been better if he kind of didn't let it go that far. I don't know. I think it's just a matter of being scandalous. That's what I'm thinking, to call it wrong. But it happened, and things like that happen, and you have to move on. So.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and many people do, because of that one incident, reject Merton's whole life. They think that he's not a role model for us, that he can't be a real, authentic spiritual guide, and that is where I disagree. You could make a mistake and still have a lot to offer. Should we end now? Okay, thank you all so much for being here.
Thank you, Kathy. And she will continue this reflection with us next week. And I'm also going to prepare you for, I will not be here next week. I am heading to India for 2 weeks, but I will be back before the series ends. And I want to prepare you for Dr. Cecilia Moore, who will reflect on Thea Bowman, an African-American Catholic nun. And that'll be another interesting episode. So stay with us till the end of the series, and hope to see you next Friday again at 7 o'clock. God bless. Good night.